Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, Quake match gameplay. This time around it is a good old-fashioned Grudge match of Beastmen against Wood Elves. And I do believe this is mostly a demonstration game. I just wanted to show this build in action. I do believe it's a pretty competitive build, and wanted to give it a shot, because I've seen other players kind of utilize similar things against me as Wood Elves. So it's a very wide, very spammy build. There are, of course, I would say, almost infinite variations of this, but it's a very powerful build against Wood Elves, I think, and I wanted to give it a shot and just demonstrate it here. For my lord, I did decide to run Kazrak One-Eye. He is the only real reason I'm running him is because he's a Vanguard capable lord. My alternatives would be Morgar and Malagor, but neither of those guys have Vanguard, and of course they don't have mounts, so their ability to actually reach the fight will be pretty limited. Kazrak otherwise is not a particularly stellar combat lord. If my opponent decides to bring Glady, Orion, or Durthu, they will easily trash Kazrak in a 1-to-1. Nonetheless, he does have decent charge bonus, maybe against a Glady in like a straight up fight, drawn out fight. If she's on a horse or foot, he could win, but that's about it. He does have the Scourge, which allows him to boost his own stats and do some poison, and then he does have Apocalyptic Vision. But being an infantry model, if he gets hit, he'll get knocked around, and perhaps that'll save his life. And so the main thing is he's fairly survivable and cheap and vanguardable. Alongside him, I did bring a Shaman of Beasts. Now, it was a little bit of a toss-up. I was definitely considering Shaman of Death for Fate of Buna and Spirit Leech against heavily armored or higher-end Elven infantry, but then I decided to go with Flock of Doom just to nuke down lightly armored infantry a little faster. I also did bring Wiston's Wild Form just for that small buff, because it is a fairly cheap spell. Usually you will be overcasting Flock of Doom, but I do like to have that variety. Of course, I also did bring Jagged Dagger, which is a nice little augment to the Winds of Magic. Otherwise, it's a very, very wide, very spammy build. The front line is composed of a single unit of Goreherd with shields. These guys are just there to soak up missile fire, backed up by 5 units of Goreherd. These guys, of course, have very high melee stats. I do believe it's 36 baseline, buffed up by an additional, or actually 35 baseline, buffed up by an additional 5 melee attack, as long as their leadership is above 50%. Essentially, much like Frenzy, these guys have Primal Fury, which isn't quite the same. It buffs their movement speed instead of their weapon strength. It doesn't buff melee attack as much. Nonetheless, it makes them very powerful, and means that these guys can definitely trash most Elven infantry, definitely in a cost-efficient manner. Behind that, we do have 2 units of Ungor Raiders. These guys are mostly there just to poke at units of priority units and kind of shoot enemy air a little bit. Obviously, they're not going to win against enemy shooting, but they can definitely apply a little bit of pressure to my opponent's backline if needed. Then out on the flanks, really a very major striking component here, we have Centaurs with great weapons, 2 units of normal Centaurs, and then Chaos Warhounds with poison. My hope is to get these guys into my opponent's backline, just trash his backline, and just kind of grind him under with sheer numbers. Even if my opponent does have a few War Dancers or Eternal Guard back there, they will not be able to stop the sheer quantity of troops, and I do have this on both flanks. And of course, then we do have Centaurs with great weapons, who are there to deal with Treekin, as well as to deal with, say, flying lords on dragons, which in this case my opponent did do. And my opponent did decide to play a little bit campy, definitely very defensive, deployed in the woods. Now, woods won't really protect you very much against Beastmen, which is something I think is important to remember, because Beastmen, none of the Beastmen units have a penalty for woods, none of their large units. It's one of their kind of unique faction perks. For this front line, though, my opponent does have Eternal Guard with shields, who can, of course, hold very, very well, backed up by a mix of Way Watchers, most likely to deal with Gorbulls and Vestigors. Some Glade Riders with Hagbane Tips, who of course can do a lot of damage, and they can kite anything that the Beastmen bring to the field. And Glade Guard with Starfire Shafts, who of course once again armor piercing and can bring down Gorbulls and Vestigors rather effectively. And otherwise they'll still do a good enough amount of damage to tear through, say, Gors. Finally, my opponent does have a Glady up on a dragon, who of course that does mean she has the breath attack, does mean she has good old Anathrema, and of course Arrow of Kurnus, so lots of damage, lots of power there. And then a Glade Lord, or then it's a little hard to get the view here, Spellslinger of Life with Dwellers Below, Regrowth, and Earthblood, as well as a Power Stone. And with the Busta Eagle, she's actually a decent melee combatant as well. So pushing in, it's definitely a very, very shooty build, so this is definitely favoring my composition, but nonetheless, we are kind of pushing in. I'm taking a pause as I see that my opponent is just purely camping back here and has not brought any, my opponent has chosen not to bring any vanguarded sort of archers out here ready to poke away at me. So what I'm doing now is I'm simply pushing forward. I'm letting the Goreherd with shields absorb the shots, and out on the flank my Centaurs are just pushing in. You can see I'm collapsing all over onto my opponent's backline, and with the goal of just overwhelming him. And of course you can see the Goreherd is getting pounded by archery fire. In the meantime, I counteract with a Flock of Doom, whittling down the Way Watchers a little bit, whittling down the Glade Guard some, and of course whittling down the Hagbanes. In the meantime, Centaurs are collapsing onto my opponent's flank. My opponent doesn't have quite the wide enough front line. You can see the poor Glade Guard is just getting slaughtered by Centaurs. Another unit of Centaurs is diving in, and they will slaughter these guys very, very promptly. In the meantime, my opponent's front line is still holding. You can see the archers are whittling down the Goreherd. Goreherd will go down pretty badly here. But in the meantime, the Centaurs are getting in. They're going to start tearing through these Glade Guard. You can see I'm just collapsing my opponent's backline. He does not have his Glade Riders on skirmish, and so they will get slaughtered. Even if they weren't, there's very little room to maneuver here, and it's kind of a box. You can see the Gorge herds are collapsing in. Unfortunately, the Gorge with shields will collapse because they simply don't have the morale. But you can see I do get a bit of another Flock of Doom over here doing some more damage, which will help the Gore herd win this fight. In the meantime, the only thing left in my opponent's backline is a few units of Way Watchers and Glade Guard, which I'm now trying to collapse spawn with my cavalry. And you can see my Ungors are kind of peppering away at the Glady, and my opponent is trying to cast a little bit of something here. You can see Dwellers Below. Dwellers Below though has been nerfed, it doesn't do as much damage now, and I do believe it only affects units that are actually in the 8 radius. These Goreherd do get clear, they get on top of the Glade Guard and are starting to slaughter them. Since it's turning into an absolute charnel house, my opponent's Spellslinger of Life, who tried to land and interfere down here, is getting surrounded and slaughtered, which is really forcing my opponent to kind of take drastic measures now. And all of his front lines basically collapsed. See that Eternal Guard over here is broken, as is this Eternal Guard here. And it's basically game over. You can see the dragon, the Glady has landed, and she'll just be surrounded and massacred. Granted, she does have some physical resist. Of course, it's a dragon, can still do damage, can do terror routing. And of course, some of my units were pushed away. The Centaurs were pushed off, the Chaos Warhounds and the Poison were pushed off, but ultimately, it is a close victory for the Beastmen. So this build, I think, is more of a demonstration match. Definitely my opponent didn't have, say, an ideal build to counteract this, but this is a very competitive build against Wood Elves nonetheless. I've utilized this, I've had this utilized against me numerous times now, and simply getting an opportunity to get a Wood Elf matchup was rather difficult, but I really wanted to demonstrate this build just so you guys how potent it can be. And the reason, of course, is that Wood Elves just don't have, they don't have quite the breadth, and even if they do go with, say, heavily anti-infantry units, which they can do, they could bring Dryads, which are, I think, a good pick. They can bring Treekin. They can definitely they can bring Durthu, who's generally a very good lord against Beastmen, just because he beats the snot out of them. They definitely have options, but nonetheless, it's very difficult for them. They can't bring enough Wild Riders to shut down this many Centaurs. 1-to-1, Centaurs won't beat Wild Riders, but 2-to-1 with Warhounds, and even if you don't commit your Centaurs with Grey Weapons, trying to keep them in reserve against armor, they will do enough damage to shred Wild Riders. And generally, your opponent won't bring more than 2. If your opponent decides to bring a powerful backline with, say, War Dancers or stuff like that, you can kind of overwhelm them. Private Anathema can only shut down 1 unit at a time. So with this many units going into your backline, if you say have 2 War Dancers, even if you have like a maximum backline coverage with 2 War Dancers, 2 Wild Riders, and Prey of Anathema, your opponent will still sneak 3 units into your backline most of the time, unless you manage to get some crazy interceptions. And that's a real problem for the Wood Elves. They just cannot cover their backline well enough against this sort of build. And if they don't bring a backline, then it's a little bit more of a problem. If they should just bring Hagbane tips, then you're definitely in a bit more of a rougher position. But even if they do that, then you can generally just kind of overwhelm their infantry, cycle charge, that sort of stuff, and win that way. So definitely, I think this is a rather powerful build. It's a very potent build. The one caveat I would have is that the Brave Shaman of Beast is not necessarily the ideal pick. He's definitely a potent pick, but potentially, if you're more worried about Treekin, if you're more worried about heavily armored troops, which of course Wood Elves, like I mentioned, can bring. They can bring Treekin, they can bring Dryads who are now fairly well armored and resistant, especially against Gores. Then yes, then I think Lore of Death could potentially be good, the superior option. Plus it does give you Spirit Leech and all that good stuff. Nonetheless, good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. It was more of a demonstration just to show this build in action and give you guys some ideas for Beastmen, because I think this is a pretty awesome build. And one that does not involve the Cygor spam, which has kind of become the meta right now. So I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below to keep up with additional content. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions like that, be sure to post down in the comments and I'll respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Bye for now.